The girl that got away. Okay, let's say it was 5 years to the day.
The following views and opinions do not necessarily represent those of the Shadow Talk Radio Network, its management, staff, or any affiliates. This is the Shadow Talk Radio Network. Shadow Talk. Dimension X Radio with Dr. William Lester is on the air now, live from Atlanta, Georgia, on shadowtalkradio.com.
And your go.
And we are live from the beautiful city of Atlanta in the Empire State of the South. Welcome to Dimension X, your weekly foray into the paranormal and the unexplained. I am your host, Dr. William Lester, and I thank you for joining me on this excursion into the unknown. This show can be heard each Saturday from 10 p.m. to midnight Eastern Standard Time right here on the Shadow Talk Radio Network. Before we get to our guest, as you know, I normally do an installment of Today in History. And of course, tonight is no exception. So let's get right to it. On this day, in 1848, James W. Marshall discovered a gold nugget at Sutter's Mill in Northern California, sparking, guess what? The gold rush of 49. On this day in 1908, the first Boy Scout troop was organized in England by Robert Baden-Powell. Today in 1924, the Russian city of St. Petersburg was renamed Leningrad in honor of the late revolutionary leader. Today in 1943, President Franklin D. Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill concluded a wartime conference in Casablanca, Morocco, by the way. In 1972, on this day, the Supreme Court struck down laws that denied welfare benefits to people who had resided in a state for less than a year. On this day in 1986, the Voyager 2 space probe swept past Uranus, coming within 50,000 miles of the seventh planet from the sun. On this day in 1989, confessed serial killer Ted Bundy was put to death in Florida's electric chair for the 1978 kidnap murder of 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. On this day in 1993, retired Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall died at the age of 84. In 1995, on this date, the prosecution gave its opening statement in the O.J. Simpson murder trial. Probably do a show on that by itself, huh? On this day in 2004, NASA's Opportunity rover landed on Mars 3 weeks after its identical twin, Spirit. And those are the moments in history that happened on this day many, many years ago. Now, to the matter at hand, this is a barn burner show tonight, y'all. We're going to talk about a subject that I've been wanting to get to since this show started. We're going to be talking about the Shroud of Turin. Now, a lot of you know what that is, and I'm guessing a few of you don't. If you've never heard of the Shroud of Turin, this is going to be school is in session. Let me just say it that way. School is in session. If you are familiar with the Shroud, it's also going to be a treat because there's a lot of new information. But you're going to be hearing from an individual that is probably one of the top authorities on the Shroud itself. So let me tell you a little about the gentleman that I'm going to bring on for you. His name is Barry M. Schwartz. Barry Schwartz was the official documenting photographer for the Shroud of Turin Research Project, the team that conducted the first in-depth scientific examination of the Shroud in 1978. Today, of course, he plays an influential role in Shroud research as the editor and publisher of the internationally recognized Shroud of Turin website, which, by the way, is www.shroud.com. The largest and most extensive Shroud resource on the internet. And that's not publicity fluff. It is the definitive web presence for the Shroud of Turin. He has participated in programs on the History Channel, the Discovery Channel, the Learning Channel, the National Geographic Channel, CNN, CBS, NBC, PBS, the BBC, and Vatican Radio. So in other words, he's all over the place. His photographs have appeared in hundreds of books and publications, including Time Magazine, Life Magazine, Newsweek, National Geographic, and, of course, countless television documentaries on some of the networks that we just mentioned. Barry Schwartz began his professional photographic career upon graduating from Brooks Institute of Photography in 1971. He operated an award-winning commercial photographic studio specializing in product, food, advertising, technical, and editorial illustration for 15 years and founded his first video production company, Educational Video, Inc., in May of 1978. From 1987 to 2001, Mr. Schwartz was an independent imaging consultant to the Laser Research and Technology Development Laboratory at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. He consulted and participated in imaging research projects with major universities, hospital, and medical device manufacturers, and produced presentations for the medical field, including slide and video programs that teach new surgical techniques to surgeons. His company served as core laboratory and provided all digital imaging services for one of these trials. His clients include many of the largest corporations in the world, and his presentations have been shown at major medical and scientific conferences worldwide and to the FDA, the U.S. House of Representatives, and the U.S. Senate. Now, as soon as I catch my breath from this impressive dossier, I will introduce Mr. Barry Schwartz. Are you with us, sir?
I am, sir.
Thank you.
I didn't expect you to read all that.
Oh, yes. Well, I like to lay the foundation for the audience to let everybody know that you are a heavyweight, you're the real deal, and that they can take great confidence in the information we're going to disseminate tonight. So just forgive. And plus, I have a very big mouth. And it affords me the opportunity to prove it once again tonight on the radio.
Well, we'll get along just fine then, William.
That's right. So, Mr. Schwartz, let's start off because, like I said, a lot of our listeners have heard of the Shroud, may not know a lot about it. Some people may know quite a bit about it, but for the folks out there who are going, oh, what is he doing tonight? I wanted to talk about aliens and Bigfoot. What, in essence, is the Shroud of Turin?
Well, the Shroud of Turin is a 14.5-foot long, 3.5-foot wide piece of linen cloth that bears the image, front and back, lengthwise, of a crucified man with bloodstains, spear wound, scourge marks, crucifixion wounds, and wounds from a cap or crown of thorns. So obviously one would expect that this is purported to be the burial shroud of Jesus.
Okay.
And so the thing that is most critical about the shroud, of course, is this image that it bears, full ventral and dorsal front and back image of a crucified man.
Okay, so now one of the things that we need to let everybody know is that Roman crucifixion was a common practice, a common method of, I guess, what you'd call capital punishment throughout the Roman Empire. So this is not something that is a rare occurrence in history, is it?
Not at all. Crucifixion was practiced regularly by the Romans. At times, hundreds of victims were crucified in a single day. They were real good at it. It was it served as a great deterrent for those coming to Rome. You can imagine the roads lined with rotting crucified victims. It probably put any criminals who were coming to Rome on notice that they didn't take crime very lightly there. So, but it was a very common torture.
I would imagine, and of course it's difficult to kind of transport yourself back in time, but I would imagine just on what I have seen, read, studied, what have you, on Roman crucifixion, that it had to be a remarkable deterrent for would-be agitators.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I think that considering that these victims were lining the roads, entering Rome, entering or leaving, I would say that it was probably an amazing deterrent, and I've often kind of jokingly said that perhaps we could use a similar deterrent for some of those neighborhoods in Los Angeles I used to live in, because it had to be a pretty horrific thing to be coming into the city and see the road lined with these victims. So crucifixion was by no means a unique or rare means of punishment or torture to the Romans.
Now, I know that today our rationale for capital punishment is, of course, to remove an individual from society that the courts deem simply too dangerous and unfit to exist in society. But the Romans did not calculate this in those terms. Now, and stop me if I'm mistaken, but the Romans calculated things in terms of shame, disgrace, and, of course, torture.
And humiliation, I think, is a good general term for it all. Mm-hmm. And of course, we know that from the gospel accounts that the purpose of crucifying Jesus was to put him up there for everybody to see and humiliate him and torture him until he died. And, of course, the thing that makes the shroud so unique is that it is as if it were a perfect document of that event. Now maybe what I should do, but if I may, just for one moment, so that the listeners understand my background, it's very important, I think, for everybody to understand that I'm not a Christian, I'm a Jew. And so my involvement with this came from being involved in a scientific project and not from any emotional, religious, or kind of spiritual reasons. I was a member of a scientific team. Okay. Of course, I'm now convinced by that same science that the shroud is, in fact, exactly what it's purported to be, and I believe that it's an artifact of the historic Jesus.
And that's a great segue, and it allows me to comment that, and you and I talked about this earlier. We know that there is a body of individuals out there that do something that I think is generally referred to as biblical archaeology. And the main thrust of biblical archaeology is to use the discipline of archaeology to verify or validate portions or parts of a particular belief system. And of course, what that does is it's almost a filtering mechanism where you exalt the archaeology that verifies your belief system, and you kind of delete or eradicate the archaeology that does not support the belief system. So we need to establish that that's not in any way, shape, or form the type of research that you've been involved in now for over 30 years.
That's exactly right. There is what I call agenda-driven science, and the shroud skeptics over the years use the same technique. I mean, it's used on both sides of the authenticity issue, frankly. So there are people guilty of it on both sides of the controversy. But it's basically you come up with what you believe to be the conclusion, and then you select those bits and pieces that fit that and just disregard with a wave of the hand those things that don't. What science does is it doesn't have an agenda. It doesn't have a preconceived notion. What it has is an opportunity to gather evidence and then follow that evidence where it leads. That was my involvement with the shroud. That was the involvement of our team, the Shroud of Turin Research Project with the shroud. Many skeptics have accused us of being a bunch of religious fanatics, but there were 3 Jewish guys on the team, a couple of atheists, some agnostics, a couple of Christians, and a couple who didn't declare what they were. And if religion had ever been discussed in the almost 2 years that we spent planning our examination of the shroud. If religion had come up as a topic at any of those meetings, about half that team would have been gone in a heartbeat. It was not about religion. It was about science. It was not about having the ability to go there and prove something. We were not there to prove the shroud was real or fake or anything else. Our purpose was really singular, and that was to determine how is the image formed on this piece of cloth. And that was the primary goal of our team, was to go and get that an answer to that one question. So we went there to do science and gather data. It is the data that we gathered that ultimately led me to my conclusion, and that took 17 years from the day I got onto that team to the day I finally was convinced by all of the evidence that the shroud must be authentic. So we didn't rush into it, and it's not agenda-driven like some of the biblical archaeology things that you and I have discussed in the past.
Yes, and you've probably seen some of the, and I'm putting my fingers in the quotation mark pattern here. Some of these documentaries. I know that there was one about Noah's Ark. There's certainly, and there've probably been several. Obviously, the James Ossuary.
James Ossuary is very, and then the Tomb of Jesus one that they had not long ago, and you know, there are a lot of these things that I call them made for television science. It's not real science. We just pretend to be scientists on TV. All of it is planned. All of it's rehearsed. None of it is the kind of extemporaneous thing that you would see in a real documentary. These are all planned, scripted discoveries, and I'm putting my fingers up in quotes when I say discoveries now. So the bottom line is, our team was a group of scientists that represented laboratories like the Los Alamos National Laboratory, Sandia Laboratory, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, the Air Force Weapons Laboratory, and a number of other scientific organizations. So we were a group of real scientists. I mean, I was not. I was one of the few non-scientists on the team, but I was a technical photographer with a lot of background in the sciences. But I'm not a scientist like these chemists and physicists were that were on our team.
But still, though, your main area of expertise is imaging, and
Correct.
you know that in and of itself, particularly, especially nowadays, maybe more so now than in the past, is its own discipline that is scientifically based.
What's really amazing is how imaging now pervades so many different sciences. Particularly, I do a lot of work in the medical field, and one of the things that, you know, as this technology evolved, almost every six or 8 months, new technology was developed allowing modern medicine to look at places in the body that we could never see before, other than maybe with an X-ray or something. And I mean, they can look inside the spinal cord. They can look at just about any place in the human body. And being able to see something allows doctors to be more accurate in their diagnoses and ultimately in their treatment. So imaging has become a major part of medicine, but it's also become a major part of everything. The Internet is a perfect example of that. Anybody can make a video and post it, and sometimes more people get to see it there than on CNN. So,
Right.
you know, the technology has brought the power to communicate down really to the grassroots, literally for the first time in human history, and that allows anyone to be able to access and use that technology for whatever purpose they wish.
I wanted to get right into a little bit of shroud history, because if the shroud image is in fact the historical Jesus of Nazareth, then that would obviously place it in first century Palestine.
It would have to be.
But we know that it first appears in the traditional historical record much, much later. Can you kind of walk us through that, and you know how
Sure.
we got to where we are? Yeah.
Well, it first appears in the historic record of approximately mid-1300s in the family of a French crusader named Geoffrey de Charnay, whose grandfather had been a crusader, or great-grandfather, and participated in the sacking of Constantinople. Why is that important? They had it in France, and that's where it pops up in the documented history with an unbroken chain pretty much until modern day. Prior to that, however, There are references to cloths in different parts of the world. One particular, however, is very interesting, and that was a cloth called the mandilion. The mandilion was in Constantinople. And when the Crusaders came and they sacked the city of Constantinople, the mandilion disappeared forever. And about 75 years later, it shows up in the hands of this French knight whose grandfather or great-grandfather had participated in the sacking of Constantinople. Now, you can draw an inference there, but a historian will tell you, well, wait a minute, there's no direct connection there. But, you know, logic, you have to sometimes see beyond the absolutes here, and you have to connect the dots. And that's a pretty good connection. It shows up in France in the hands of a relative of the man who was there when they sacked Constantinople, and the mandilion disappears from Constantinople, never to be seen again. The mandilion was purported to be the shroud, the burial shroud of Jesus, and it had an image on it. So there is, in my mind, little doubt that we're talking about the same cloth, but because of the gap in time, you know, the experts have to be honest and say, look, there's a break in the history here. But, you know, if you look at any other artifact that we study, you'll see that almost every artifact we have, there are gaps in its history. Nobody seems to mind that as much, except with the Shroud of Turin. And I have to share a little quick story with you. My little 85-year-old Jewish mother, when she heard my first lecture on the Shroud, I asked her what she thought of this, and she said, well, of course it's authentic. And I was shocked. She was 85, born in Poland, immigrated to Ellis Island when she was a little girl. And I said to her, Mother, what makes you say that it has to be authentic? And she said, Barry, in typical Jewish mother style, Barry, they wouldn't have kept it for 2,000 years if it hadn't belonged to Jesus. Well, I thought about that, and I kind of laughed. I thought it was humorous. And then the more I thought about it, the more I realized there's a certain fundamental logic there. And she's right. It's a burial shroud that got separated from the body. It's a Jewish burial shroud that has blood on it. So Jews are forbidden to even possess this, and yet when the disciples go into the tomb and find this cloth there, blood-stained cloth, they're not going to just leave it there. But they can't tell anybody they've got it, so they keep it a secret for perhaps even hundreds of years. What's amazing is that the first depiction of Jesus, as we have come to know the way he looks today and as he appears on the shroud, is at like 285 A.D. in the Domitia Catacomb in Rome. So there's 250 years there where there's no record, no discussion of it, no descriptions of it, other than what some people perceive as clues in the Gospels, but no hard evidence for its existence. And suddenly, this image in this catacomb shows up looking like the man on the shroud and depicting Jesus.
I want to stay on this line of conversation, but I've got my first question from the chat room because you know it's going to be hot tonight. Okay.
Well, I'm ready.
Okay. The first it says, "What do you think of the Spear of Destiny?" And I think we briefly touched on this. What is your take on that?
Well, I'll be candid with you. There are so many of these kinds of religious objects, relics, whatever you want to call them. My study has been focused in on one that is very tangible, that is very unique in all of the world. So I don't have an opinion on the spear. I know that others have studied it. I have not. So I'm sorry not to be able to give you an answer, but I'd rather be honest and say I don't know and haven't made any study of it than to make something up just to sound like I know what I'm talking about. So in this particular case, I've not really studied that at all.
Okay, I want to get back to this historical angle.
Sure.
What would have been the typical Jewish or first century Palestine Jewish burial procedure that, you know, Jesus of Nazareth or any crucifixion victim would have undergone? Okay,
very simple. The very first thing that would have happened is as soon as he would have been brought off the cross, known to be dead already, the very first thing they would have done was use a smaller cloth and cover his face. If you look at modern society in almost every culture today, that tradition still is maintained, and we always covered the face of even at an accident scene or something like that, they always cover the face with what we call a head cloth or a head wrapping. That would have been the first thing done with Jesus. Then he would have been taken to the tomb where his body would have then begun to be prepared. Remember, this was Friday afternoon. The Sabbath was fast approaching at sundown. They did not have the time for full and proper burial preparation, So they would have done preliminary washing. They would have removed the face cloth and set it aside, and then they would have wiped the body at least peripherally clean, and then they would have laid the body out on this long, narrow sheet with his head in the middle, and they would have wrapped the cloth over his head and back down to his feet, and that explains the head-to-head images on the Shroud of Turin. That was standard Jewish burial custom. Now, what they would have done before moving the body would have taken strips of linen, just as it's mentioned in the Gospels, and they would have tied those strips around the neck, around the torso, and around the legs so that when the body's moved, the cloth wouldn't fall off. Because Jesus had not been fully prepared, and the intent was to come back Sunday morning to finish what they'd begun, it's most likely that they wouldn't have done that at that moment in time. Now, we know from the Gospel accounts that when the tomb is opened Sunday, the body is gone, but both cloths were there, one wrapped up or folded and put in a separate place, and the shroud was there as well. What most people aren't aware of is that there's a cloth in Oviedo, Spain, called the Sudarium of Oviedo, dated all the way back to the 6th century, unbroken chain of custody, and that has bloodstains that match the bloodstains on the back of the head of the shroud. Those bloodstains are congruent with each other, indicating that they may have wrapped the same man. So many people have said to me, well, the Gospel says 2 cloths and the shroud is a single cloth. But the second cloth, the Sudarium, the head wrapping, does exist. And actually on the website, if you type Sudarium into the search engine on shroud.com, you'll get all kinds of stuff about the Sudarium. I consider that close enough relation to the shroud for me to incorporate that into the website, which is really focused mainly on the shroud. So that's what the custom would have been, and that's what we see on the shroud.
So with this head cloth, has it received the same degree of scientific examination as the shroud itself?
In the last 20 or 30 years, it's received a significant amount of study, mainly because of its connection to the shroud, and because so much study has been put into the shroud that it made it sort of imperative to look closer at the Sudarium. One of the things that did come out over time, a couple of years, probably 10 years ago, was that the blood type on the 2 cloths was identical. The only problem with that is that when one types blood, you're looking for particular enzymes in the blood that are responsible for the type. The problem is, as those enzymes age and degrade, the absence of those enzymes equals type AB, and that's what we find on the shroud and on the Sudarium. But now it would seem that all old degraded blood will type pretty much to type AB, so that's no longer a significant comparison between the shroud and the Sudarium. To me, the more important kind of connection between the two is the fact that the shape of the bloodstains on the Sudarium match one of the major bloodstains on the head of the shroud, and it would appear that both cloths were on the same person, the same wounds. Again, that's there's no way to be absolute about that. But that is what science is able to tell us from the data that we've gathered so far.
But if like you said, I mean, if you can't make an absolute correlation, the preponderance of the scientific evidence would lead one to conclude that yes, this head cloth was in fact part of the shroud burial process.
I would say so. I would say the preponderance of the evidence, where the evidence on the shroud, considering how much more study has been applied to it, I would say the evidence for the shroud is so overwhelming as to say that in a courtroom, I think it would be convincing beyond a reasonable doubt. In other words, the highest standard. The evidence is just literally so compelling and so overwhelming that it was enough to convince me, after 17 years, that the only correct answer for this is that it's just what it's purported to be. This is an artifact of the historic Jesus. And, that's not really a religious statement. That's a statement based on the study of the cloth first. Honestly, when I first got to Turin, I was expecting to find the paint and the brushstrokes and come home. And, I was in my early 30s. I'm thinking, wow, a free trip to Italy. How cool.
Right.
And in the end, here it is 32 years later, and I'm more involved with it now than I was then. And if somebody had told me that 32 years ago, I would have laughed. I would have said, no way would I ever be involved with anything beyond doing the job that I went there to do, make the photographs, document the other materials, and that's it, move on. So nobody is more surprised to find me still doing this than I am.
We're coming up on our first break. We just blew by that first 30 minutes, ladies and gentlemen, like I knew we would. When we get back, we're going to get into some of the injury manifestations on the shroud images. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Dimension X. I'm your host, Dr. William Lester. My guest tonight is Mr. Barry M. Schwartz, and we are talking about the Shroud of Turin. We'll be right back after these messages.
UFO studies, ancient mysteries, paranormal studies, cryptozoological sciences, demonology, extraterrestrial archaeology, temporal sciences, conspiratorial studies. These courses and more can be found at the Institute of Metaphysics. From the mysteries, knowledge. instituteofmetaphysics.com.
Have you been wondering what gift to get that special person in your life? Then you need to visit Mountain View Candleworks, your one-stop headquarters for candles, fountains, specialty foods, and much more. Just visit www.mountainviewcandleworks.com. We make your candles with mountain care.
Dimension X Radio with Dr. William Lester is on the air now, live from Atlanta, Georgia, on shadowtalkradio.com. Dimension X Radio with your host, Dr. William Lester, live from Atlanta, Georgia, on the Shadow Talk Radio Network.
Yes, it is, and we are back live on Dimension X with Mr. Barry M. Schwartz, and we have initiated our conversation about one of the most fascinating archaeological/historical artifacts ever, the Shroud of Turin. And in the first half hour, we did a little description of the shroud itself and did a little historical background to kind of establish the chain of command, or the chain of ownership, if you will. But Mr. Schwartz, I want to get right into some of the injury aspects of the shroud, because number one, it gives a remarkable insight into the brutality of Roman crucifixion that is often absent in much of the medieval and Renaissance crucifixion scenes and artwork that really it's formed the basis of kind of our image of crucifixion. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I'm just going to say, I think that artists over the years, over the centuries, have, tried to depict it as gruesomely as possible, but because of the artistic license that an artist has, they put a modesty cloth over his genital area, mount, and you know what? It's so brutal and it's really so horrible that I think most artists couldn't conceive of how bad it really was. Wounds that are evident on the man of the shroud. Let's start with, first of all, the face. Badly beaten, swollen cheekbones. Both cheekbones, but one far more swollen, obviously a big bruise on this one cheekbone, and less so, but still on the other. So we can see that the man was beaten severely about the face. Then the scourge marks. The Romans used a number of different instruments to scourge people. In Mel Gibson's movie, he showed hooks on the end of the flagrum, which is the Roman three-thonged whip that was typically used. But those hooks would have killed the man literally in minutes. Those were called scorpione, and that's not what they would have used on Jesus. The idea was for him to die on the cross, not on the ground. They whipped him with what, and we have evidence of these been found in Roman ruins. They were dumbbell-shaped lead weights that were bound to the end of these thongs of leather. And when they hit you, they left dumbbell-shaped bruises, cutting the flesh, but they left marks, and there are about 120 visible on the man of the shroud. And, of course, then he was crowned with a cap or crown of thorns, and we have bloodstains on the top of the head and the back of the head, evidence of that. And when people ask me why I think it's Jesus, well, he's the only man in history that I think that's been documented ever to have had this crown of thorns put on his head. That was not typical of Roman crucifixions, so it went way beyond the crucifixion. Of course, leading to the crucifixion, there are crucifixion wounds in the hands and feet of the man of the shroud. But what's most amazing, particularly with the ones in the hand, we can only see an exit wound, but it's at the wrist. Every artwork that we've practically ever seen, except modern ones based on the shroud itself, show the spikes being driven through the palms of the hands. Artists still do that. And yet, forensically, that's far less practical for somebody that's got to do 100 crucifixions in a day. You don't want these people tearing their hands loose and trying to get off the cross. So if you nail them in that fleshy part of the palm nearer to the wrist and go through it at diagonal, you'll get an exit wound exactly where we have it on the shroud, and that hand can never be removed from that cross without help from somebody else. But the victim himself could not remove his hand.
So the theory being that the flesh in the palms of the hand would have insufficient strength to support the weight of a grown man.
Technically, it's been proven that they could support the weight, but when you're being tortured like that, it's amazing how much adrenaline is pumping through your bloodstream, and you could rip your hand loose, maybe tearing through the flesh between the fingers to get the hand loose. But you can't do that when you get up near that wrist. So I think that the Romans knew exactly what they were doing. It was no mystery to them, and we see these wounds in the wrist rather than the palm, which is forensically much more accurate than any of the artistic depictions made of the crucifixion.
Let me back up and let me back up and get back to that the crown of thorns issue, because and I think you alluded to it. What you find on the shroud image on the head, does it not indicate that these thorns or whatever they were actually totally covering the top of this man's head? In other words, it wasn't a circlet or a ringlet.
No, that again is the artistic license of medieval Renaissance and even modern artists to show a beautiful crown of, for Jesus. But that crown was meant to humiliate him. He claimed to be the king of the Jews, so they gave him a crown. And they took this thorny bush, if you will, and they smashed it down on his head. So you want to be a king, here's your crown. It was a humiliation factor, not something beautiful. I mean, I've seen golden crowns and stuff. Look, the Romans wouldn't have done that. I mean, it's a nice image. It's a nicer image than a nasty big bush of thorns cutting the heck out of the top of your and back of your head. But that's really what they would have done. And of course, it's one of the things, as I said, that convinces me this is most likely Jesus, is because that wasn't documented on any other victim that we know of in all of recorded history. So, and of course, that's not all the wounds. We still have more yet.
Yes.
We have a spear wound in the side of the man. Now, what's most interesting about the spear wound, it's the darkest blood stain on the shroud. If we read what it says in the Gospels, they said when they stuck the spear in him, he was already dead, and it issued forth water and blood. What's amazing about that spear wound on the shroud is when you view it with ultraviolet fluorescence photography, you can see the serum stain that's invisible to the naked eye, but you can see the serum stain that surrounds that blood stain. And there would have been serum and probably other fluid, perhaps from the lungs, that would have been in his chest. He was suffering from anaphylactic and traumatic shock. He hadn't been given any water. His lungs were going to fill up, and he was going to suffocate. And the other thing that's interesting that's missing from the image of the man on the shroud are broken legs, which was sort of typical. They would do this to hurry up and get it over with because they needed the cross for the next victim. And when they were going to do that with Jesus, he was already dead. And at least that's how it says in the four Gospels. And yet that's what we find on the shroud. The man's legs are not broken. So there's so much that matches the Gospel accounts that one skeptic I was debating with one time said, well, the shroud is too perfect, so it can't be real. And I said, so if it were less perfect, then you would accept it as authentic. And he said, well, of course not. So the point is that no matter how much evidence there is, people who've already made up their mind have already made up their mind. That's it.
And people should understand. People should understand because we've already, some of this conversation has already taken a very graphic turn, and I want people to understand that this is not gratuitous language for the purpose of radio, but in order to understand the image itself, you've got to understand the injuries and wounds that this individual suffered in a modern medical forensic in forensic terms, to underscore the reality of it.
Well, we're all accustomed now with all the television programs on crime scene investigations and things of that nature. We're much more aware of forensics now than we were even 10 years ago. And so under those sort of terms, we've all become a little better educated about what forensics can do, and the shroud has been studied by no less than 2 major forensic experts in modern times, and back in the 30s by a French doctor, Pierre Barbet, who was sort of the first medical person to examine the shroud with a critical eye towards the specifics of the wounds, etc. After that, it was Robert Buckland, the medical examiner who the television show Quincy was based on, and who was a consultant to that program. He accepted the shroud as authentic and claimed that it was virtually a crime scene and everything was absolutely 100% accurate. And then in more recent years, Dr. Frederick Zugaby, who's written a book on the subject, The Crucifixion of Jesus, A Forensic Inquiry, and he details this beyond where, it's not for the faint of heart, because this is real serious stuff. But that book, Dr. Zugaby is the world's foremost authority on the effects of crucifixion on the human body. He's been studying it for over 50 years. And his belief is that there is no doubt that the blood stains on the shroud are natural blood flows that came by the cloth contacting the body that was doing the bleeding. So, we know that These are not painted on. We also know that where there's blood on the shroud, there's no image. The blood or serum acted to inhibit the image formation mechanism, whatever that might have been. And so, that would have meant that some artist would have first had to put natural blood flows on the shroud and then paint his artwork around it. And then remember to put in invisible serum stains that we could only find in the 20th century. So, the more people talk about this being some kind of fake or forgery or hoax or painting, the funnier it is to me, because it's just impossible.
And I want to get into the hoax angle in the after our next break, but right now, sure. I want to ask a question, and to some people it may seem extraneous, and to some people it may seem obvious, but I don't think so, because I did read the book that you referenced. What is the medical opinion about the cause of death of the man on the shroud?
Well, for many years, Buckland, for example, and Barbet both believed it was asphyxiation. But Zugby came along and looked at the condition of the body, and from the experience of 25,000 autopsies on his own, determined that this man, first because he was given no water, was most likely in anaphylactic shock, and of course was in traumatic shock from all the tortures that were applied. So ultimately, his heart probably stopped because he was in shock. Mm-hmm. And Dr. Zugby believes, and I tend, while you're up there, when you are bound to a cross the way Jesus was. So asphyxiation becomes...
the lingered alive on the cross for 2, sometimes 3 days, yet the gospel account indicates died relatively quickly. Why would that be?
Well, first of all, remember that his torture began literally the night before in the Garden of Gethsemane, where they beat him up. Then they made him drag the patibulum, the crossbeam of the cross, not the way they show it in the movies where you drag the entire cross, because the Romans didn't have time for such nonsense. They already had the vertical beams already in the ground, and there was a hole cut in the patibulum, which is the crossbeam, and that's what the victims carried, and then they were attached to it and hoisted up and hooked over the top, and that was it. So he had to carry all that. He was then scourged, and I got to tell you, even though the lead-shaped dumbbell-shaped lead weights on the flagrum used did not kill him, they weakened him dramatically. Once again, no water. And then, of course, the pain, the severe pain of this crown of thorns, and, of course, the excruciating pain of crucifixion. This died because, ultimately, the tortures went on for about 30 hours. And, you can only live so long, not given any water, not given any comfort or any respite from it. You're going to die.
Now, I've seen, and again, we're having to reference again the numerous or the innumerable art, Renaissance, medieval period artwork. What about the wounds, the nail spikes in the feet area?
Well, it's a good question. I actually had a phone call today from a gentleman who wanted to know specifically about those and what we could tell from the bloodstains on the feet of the man of the shroud. Mm-hmm. The problem we have with the shroud is one of the 2 feet the knee was raised and the foot is flat on the cloth, and we can see literally the entire sole of the foot. The other foot, however, was stretched completely straight, and we only see the back of the heel. It is impossible, from looking at the bloodstains on the Shroud of Turin, to determine whether a single spike was used to fasten both feet, or whether a spike was used for each foot on either side, which was actually easier for the Romans to do. But there is a raging debate that will probably go on forever as to whether there were 3 nails or 4, but more likely, although we will never know that from the image and the bloodstains on the shroud, just because of the way they are on the cloth, we'll never be certain of that, but it's probably more likely. The simplest way was to fasten each leg on either side of the vertical upright of the cross and just nail them through the side. The reason we believe that's true is that in the early 60s or maybe it was late 50s, they found the ankle bone of Jehohanan, a crucifixion victim from Roman times. And the spike went through the side of his ankle, and it would have come out the other side and right into the wooden vertical upright of the cross.
Good
so
Lord.
that's one of the pieces of evidence we have as to how the Romans did defeat, because they did it so often they didn't bother to write it down. It was just so commonplace. Nobody thought it was very important enough to sort of record exactly how it was done. So we don't have any absolutes,
That's an interesting little side angle there that, I guess for a lot of people who are, traditional Christians, Protestants, what have you, have to, when you put this in its full historical context, what you've got to understand, to the Roman officers who were assigned to this task, Jesus was not much more than another Jewish rabble-rouser that had to be put down. Mm-hmm.
Yep, just another, troublemaker that we're getting rid of. And, it was one of countless numbers of crucifixion victims that were done over the years there. And to them, this was just business as usual. Mm-hmm. Of course, because it's Jesus, the whole purpose and sort of the effect of that crucifixion is still being felt 2,000 years later. So,
sure.
But that's because of who he was, not because of what they did to him specifically, but because who this man was. So I think that from my point of view, when I look at the man of the shroud, I see one of the most important things I think the shroud is a document of the crucifixion, of the tortures he suffered. Now, as a Jew, remember, I look at this very clinically because I don't have the emotional tie to it that anybody raised in Christianity would have.
Right.
So I can kind of stay at arm's length of this and just sort of study it from a scientific point of view. But when you look at what this man suffered, I mean, it's amazing that he survived as long as he did.
What can we tell on the image about the body, the man in general? Was he average sized man? Was he tall, short, stocky, thin? What was his general body type?
First, let me sort of preface the answer by reminding everyone that the shroud is linen cloth, which has been hung from balconies vertically with weights on the bottom, so it is not a solid substrate like a piece of wood or even a stretched canvas would be. This is a piece of linen cloth that can stretch and change its dimensions as much as a centimeter or so just based on the relative humidity in the air that it's kept in.
Right.
But the man of the shroud is approximately 5'11". And a lot of people have said, well, that's too tall for a first century man. Not necessarily, because they have found remains of men of first century origin that are over 6 feet. So he would have been tall and stately for a man of that era, but certainly not so extraordinarily so that we would have had to say, oh, well, he was extraordinarily tall. I think if he were so far beyond normal, then they might have mentioned that in the Gospels. But remember, there's really very little description of Jesus in any of the Gospels.
That's
so
right.
We have to sort of go from what we have. But I think that he was of a well-built stature. But remember, if this is the man that we all believe it was, he was a carpenter. He worked outdoors. He had to have a certain level of developed strength and for doing the work that he did. So he was a well-built man, about a 5'11". There's an interesting sideline. There's something called the Garden Tomb over in Israel, and there's a cutout where a body would have been, and many people believe that was his tomb. And the space, the way they did it was they would kind of create a shelf, and then when the body was brought in, they would dig out where the feet were so that the body would fit, because they would make the shelf a standard size. It turns out that the man that would have been in the Garden Tomb would have been 5'11". That's the measurement of that space in that particular tomb. Now, I'm not claiming that that's necessarily the accurate tomb of Jesus, but that seems to be an interesting coincidence.
You know, it is one of the great fallacies that a lot of people do have about history is that, like you said, assuming that this man was obviously too tall to actually have been, a man of the first century. And like you said, that is not true. I think
Correct.
Where people mistake is that the average height of a man might have been less than it is today.
Right.
When you take the population as a whole, of course, the population was much smaller then.
And because food was not as good, there were no health. I mean, there was no knowledge of proper health care and those kind of things. So people didn't live as long and probably didn't grow as large in general as we do today.
Right. But there were. But I mean,
uh,
if you could have walked down the street, and if you could have walked down the street in Jerusalem in the first century, you would have seen people 5'8", 5'9", 5'10", a few
Or
people.
more.
Yeah, right. So
they have found remains of men over 6 feet. So
exactly. I was going to ask about you referenced the lance wound. Why did they do that? Were they checked to see if he was dead, or was that just some random soldier just throwing a spear?
No, I think that the typical thing would be that to test to see if somebody was dead or alive, you stick a spear in them. If they're alive, they're going to react. If they're not, then they don't. They're issued forth this blood flow and serum or other fluids, perhaps in the lungs, and that was a pretty good indicator that he was dead. And it was that test that prevented them from breaking the legs. They were going to see if he were still alive, they'd have broken the legs and let him, sit there longer until he was completely dead. He was already dead. Mm-hmm. But that's because it was the cumulative effect of 30 hours of, accumulated torture that culminated with the crucifixion. But they tortured him for hours before that. So, it's one of those things that the human body can withstand a lot. But there are some limits. One of the big things about the shroud that was a deal breaker when I first saw it was the fact that the blood stains on the shroud are still red. And we all know that old blood turns black or brown pretty quickly. And when I first saw that, I said, well, that just means it can't be real. It took 17 years. That was the last question I needed answered before I became convinced. And the interesting answer is that when you're tortured like this man was, your red blood cells start to break down, and the liver starts flooding your bloodstream with bilirubin. And when when you go through that experience, your blood stays red when you die. Even if you bleed out, it doesn't ever turn black or brown.
We just have a few minutes before the top of the hour break, and I want to sneak this in. This is probably more philosophical than scientific.
Okay.
Why? Okay, we look at the gospel as historians. We sometimes look at the gospel accounts as somewhat dubious, because the gospel writers were not historians in the sense that we think of historians.
Nor were they often eyewitnesses to the events they wrote about.
But yet, the gospel accounts of Jesus' crucifixion are correlate beautifully to the image on the shroud,
and to each other. Right. And so one can look at that and say, because these are four different accounts by four different men at four different times, and they all tell the exact same basic story as to what was done with this man, then we could reasonably, I think, feel comfortable in assuming that that's probably what happened, and that's exactly what's documented on the Shroud of Turin.
Right. And so I guess it just goes to show that when you're reading the gospel accounts, there is some reliable historical information there, but you kind of have to parse it out and remember. And I think
that's the biggest issue in my mind as to how reliable they would be is the fact that they were written in Aramaic, translated to Greek, translated to Latin, and then translated to English. Mm-hmm. And unintentional errors or biases can creep in there that are not malicious or intentional, but can creep in nonetheless. And so I think that that's why one has to be careful in listening. And I know a lot of Christians, good friends of mine, who are biblical literalists, who virtually take the words as the gospel, literally. And that's certainly fine from their perspective. I'm a little more cautious than that. I come from more of a scientific background, obviously. But I think that we can feel reasonably comfortable that the description of the crucifixion and the tortures of Jesus are reasonably accurate, and they're so perfectly documented on the shroud as to make me think, well, what else could this be? It cannot be anyone else.
We are right up at the top of the hour, 1 hour down, 1 hour to go, ladies and gentlemen. We are discussing the Shroud of Turin with imaging expert Mr. Barry M. Schwartz. We'll be right back to Dimension X after these messages.
Have you been wondering what gift to get that special person in your life? Then you need to visit Mountain View Candleworks, your one-stop headquarters for candles, fountains, specialty foods, and much more. Just visit www.mountainviewcandleworks.com. We make your candles with mountain care.
UFO studies, ancient mysteries, paranormal studies, cryptozoological sciences, demonology, extraterrestrial archaeology, temporal sciences, conspiratorial studies. These courses and more can be found at the Institute of Metaphysics. From the mysteries, knowledge. instituteofmetaphysics.com.
Did you hear that? Do you believe? You will. Don't miss ShadowCon, coming March 27, 2009, in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, hosted by the Kentucky Shadow Chasers. Meet Shannon Sylvia, Keith Age, Brian Harnois, and many others as we explore the world of the supernatural and the paranormal. It's an event you'll never forget, including an investigation into the Mothman at Point Pleasant, West Virginia. It's coming March 27th, 2009. ShadowCon. ShadowCon, hosted by the Kentucky Shadow Chasers. You will believe.
I want the money.
for telling.
This is Dimension X Radio with your host, Dr. William Lester, live from Atlanta, Georgia, on the Shadow Talk Radio Network.
Another reason to listen to Dimension X, the best bumper music on the radio. My guest tonight is Mr. Barry M. Schwartz. We are discussing the Shroud of Turin. Fascinating topic. And we've talked about a lot of the historical, forensic, and medical characteristics of the Shroud. Of course, there are those down through the years as the Shroud has been examined, and of course today as well, who remain skeptical that the Shroud is indeed an authentic artifact. And I know I've heard everything from medieval forgery. I've heard references or allegations around Da Vinci, and just every conceivable thing. But let me ask about the process that is generally called carbon dating, because I know that it's been fairly controversial. Talk about Mr. Schwartz, the initial carbon dating test, and where we are today.
Okay. In 1988, 3 laboratories were chosen. A bunch of scientists got together and developed a protocol, and ultimately, originally 7 laboratories were going to be involved, and in the end they only went with 3. And they took one sample, a small sample from one corner, and divided it in thirds amongst the 3 laboratories. The problem with that was that the argument had been prior to the actual sample taking, that taking a single sample, if there was anything questionable about that sample, then there would really be no control to compare it to. And so the argument was to take at least 1 or 2 samples from other areas, but they decided not to. Now, as supposedly as well planned as this event was, this carbon dating, when they actually got into the room with the Shroud to remove the sample, they stood over it and argued for about an hour and a half as to where they were going to take it from. In the end, they took it from one corner adjacent to a seam and down about as far away from everything as you could get. Also, one of the most heavily worn areas and handled areas of the Shroud, where it had been held by bishops by these corners countless numbers of times and displayed from balconies and things of that nature. In the end, the other part of the protocol that was absent, the protocol called for the chemical analysis of the samples prior to them being burnt and ultimately destroyed in the carbon dating tests. Not one of the 3 laboratories performed that chemical analysis. The reason they stated that they didn't was this was supposed to be a blind study. They weren't supposed to know which sample was from the Shroud. But they couldn't find another herringbone woven cloth to use as a control. So all the labs immediately knew which sample was from the Shroud. So because of that, they said, well, we knew it was from the Shroud, so we didn't need to do the chemical analysis.
Well, now you're saying that as if you don't think that was the real reason.
No, I'm saying that because I think that was just bad science.
Okay.
And I think that what I really believe, and again, this is sticking my neck out a little bit, I believe that the motive was less to get it right and more to get it done. And people have asked me, why would these 3 labs agree to a single sample knowing full well that it's very hard to make claims from one little test? Okay. And my answer has always been the same, that they knew that in 3 or 4 months they were going to be world famous, which is exactly what happened. So I think that science was sort of, given kind of the low priority here. Let's just get this done and get something out there and prove it's a fake and move on.
Okay.
And again, I'm not saying that the labs were trying to prove it a fake. I'm just saying that was quick enough and good enough so that they didn't do the rigorous science that one would have expected from labs of this caliber. Not necessarily a fault of the lab. Remember that they didn't choose the site of the sample or take that sample themselves. The Turin authorities cut the sample and delivered pieces of the sample to them. So we can't blame them for where the samples were taken. But I think what was at fault was the fact that they should have performed this chemical analysis, because interestingly enough, 20 years later, in 1998 or 2000, some folks took the photographs that were made of the samples that were taken from the shroud in the 88 and showed them to 3 independent textile experts. And these people didn't know they were looking at a piece of the shroud. They just thought it was a piece of linen. And all 3 independent textile experts all said the same thing. Well, this is ancient linen, and it looks like it's been rewoven. Well, this sort of started a whole new ball rolling in the world of the shrouds, because if, in fact, there was a more recent reweaving in that corner where the sample was taken, then the resulting C14 date that was achieved by the 3 labs would then be erroneous based on dating some newer materials along with the old. Interestingly enough, if you look at the samples, and look at the dates achieved by the labs, you'll see that as the samples moved away from that seam, the dates changed consistently. So there is there is a massive amount of evidence now that those samples were in fact anomalous. As a matter of fact, I just published an article by two experts. One is 40 pages, and the addendum I just put up is 19 more pages, listing all the evidence that proves that corner is anomalous. It's overwhelming, and it goes all the way back to the 1988 dating, to the paper published in the journal Radiocarbon where they announced their results, where the Oxford Laboratory reported in their results that they had found random spurious cotton in their sample, and they couldn't explain it. Well, had they done that chemical analysis before they did the test, they might have gone back to the Turin authorities and said, look, we're finding a lot of cotton here. That's not right. This is a linen shroud, not cotton. Why are we finding this cotton? It's a question mark. We need to get a sample from somewhere else. That didn't happen. What happened was the 3 labs got the date, and they put them up on a blackboard and sat there kind of smug and said, anybody who still believes the shroud's authentic is a flat earther. So I guess I was a flat earther for 20 years.
You see, and again, we're not casting aspersions here, but see, here's what I know, because I've spent many years, dealing and looking at many areas of unexplained phenomena.
Sure.
If I go to a lab and I say, here's a piece of something that fell off of a flying saucer, I want you to analyze it. Well, I guarantee you that the results of the test will be, oh, this is a piece of aluminum foil that you took out of the kitchen. I guarantee you that's the results. But if I go into a lab and say, here's a chunk of metal I found in the backyard, will you examine it?
Can you tell me what this is?
Exactly. Then oh, well, this is unusual. It's got some funny isotope readings. It's anomalous. And, that's just kind of the nature of the beast when you're dealing with,
It's an inherent bias.
Exactly. We're not going to deal with something so anomalous that it's going to cause us to have to rewrite any textbooks or rethink our paradigm, etc. So it doesn't surprise.
Well, I was just going to say, it's so much easier to maintain the status quo than to change something.
Mm-hmm. Now, and this issue of carbon dating. Now, I don't know anything about the process. I don't know anything, technically about carbon dating. Is carbon dating today in 2009 a reliable method to date objects?
In general, yes.
Mm-hmm.
I say in general, so I'm qualifying that. There are some organic materials that will date erroneously. For example, all the way into the future. Certain mollusks, if you carbon date certain mollusks, you're going to get a future date. There's also the story of the ibis mummies in the Manchester Museum in England. Dr. Rosalie David is an expert. And, when the these ibis, when the Egyptians buried their dead, when we go to a cemetery, we bring flowers. The Egyptians brought little mummies of birds, ibises.
Right.
And so there are tens of thousands of these, and they were throwaways. They left them behind. These were not cherished things. These were tokens, like flowers would be. Interestingly enough, when Dr. David took some of these mummies and she unwrapped them, and she dated the contents, the little bird on the inside, and then dated the wrappings, it was 900 years difference. And how is that possible? Right. It's not possible because nobody took one of these little throwaway mummy things and rewrapped it with newer materials or older materials. Nobody would do that. And so we have evidence that carbon dating can be misleading at best. Now, in general, I have to say that carbon dating is reasonably reliable. It's based on real science, and it is reliable for many things. But when you test something for radiocarbon dating, you have to know what it is you're testing, and you have to be reasonably assured that what you're testing isn't skewed for some unknown reason. In the case of the shroud, look, if there was this invisible reweaving as it's known, by the way, that was perfected in the French court at the same time the shroud was in France, interestingly enough, is when this technique was developed, and it was extremely meticulous. I mean, literally replacing one thread at a time. It took forever, and it took really skilled hands, so it never caught on as something that the masses would use. It was too expensive. But the French court could well afford to do this. And
Sure.
when they created this rewoven corner, if you look right next to the area that they sampled for carbon dating, was a patch cutout, a piece cut out by the owners of the shroud, perhaps to distribute them as relics or to even sell them to raise money. And what happens when you take a woven piece of cloth and you cut a piece out of it? It starts to unravel.
Right.
And so they had to mend it. And they did this. And this was not some documented repair like, you know, when the shroud was burned in a fire in 1532. In 1534, the Poor Clare nuns sewed a backing cloth and sewed patches in. That's a well-documented repair from a well-documented event, the fire. But this was just a preventive maintenance kind of thing. It was not documented. But we have so much overwhelming evidence, even if you look at my photos from 1978, that area is darker than the linen right next to it, and that's because the cotton was interwoven with the linen because cotton takes dye better. There was a chemical applied to the linen so it would take the dye at least somewhat, and then somebody used the dye applied to the surface after it was rewoven to match the color of that area to the rest of the shroud. Well, over time, that dyed area changed and aged indifferently and slightly darker than the rest of the shroud. And you can see it with the naked eye. Nobody paid any attention in 1988 to the work we did in 78. And consequently, they went right to this corner, which we could have told them right from the beginning, not the best place to go. But they weren't listening to us.
Well,
so you have this fiasco, the headlines around the world, shroud is a fake.
I
when
remember.
In fact, there were like, let's just use the arbitrary number of 100 tests performed on the shroud. 99 of those tests point toward it being old enough to be real. One test goes the other way. Now, if you're a scientist, do you throw away the 99 in favor of the one, or do you go back and you re-examine that one and say, well, why are we getting such a variation here? Well, unfortunately, the world threw away those 99 and kept the one. And for those of us who had studied this and who were pretty much convinced and who knew of historical evidence proving the shroud absolutely is older than what they claimed. There's historical evidence that proves it. We knew that. So we became flat earthers in the eyes of the gentleman from the Oxford Laboratory. And,
well, you can never allow the facts to get in the way.
Well, especially if you've already decided what result you want, then who cares about the facts? And this has been very frustrating for those. And a lot of people say, well, why am I even worried about this? This isn't even a reflection of my personal faith. And I said, well, the truth is the truth. I was given this great privilege to examine this, to be the first in history to examine this properly, scientifically. I was one of 24 guys given that privilege. And that privilege brought with it some obligation to make these materials available afterwards to everyone else. And I felt so frustrated by the inaccurate, sometimes completely bold-faced lies of media reports about the shroud.
You're kidding, media? You're kidding. I'm appalled.
Oh, really? I'm surprised, I'm sure, right? And look, I've been a part of the media for most of my career, too. So, I was so appalled by this that I felt compelled. I said, look, I've got all this material. I have all this evidence, enough to convince me who's I'm sure many of your listeners go, well, this guy's a non-believer. Well, that's correct.
Right. Mm-hmm.
But it was enough evidence to convince me, and I felt that it was imperative for me to make this material available so everyone would have access to the same materials that ultimately convinced this nice Jewish old hippie photographer that this piece of cloth wrapped Jesus.
Well, see, you know what I think, and I'm going to say something that's slightly controversial here. There's a deep psychological thing going on with with the shroud and with some other anomalies that we cover on this show.
Sure.
And I think, and this is how I kind of ration it out. If you date the shroud to the 1st century, then you correlate the injuries of the man, and the inevitable conclusion is that this is the historical Jesus. Okay. Now that's from a purely historical standpoint. Now, I don't care what your belief system is, or even if you don't even have one. That, we're putting that to the side for a second.
Sure.
But if you establish all of that, then you have to take the next step in saying, okay, this thing is real. We don't know how the image was formed. That means that we have the historical image, or we have the image of the historical Jesus formed in a way that is anomalous. That means that there is something about the historical Jesus that is anomalous and can't be explained. And that infers all kinds of things that people will make theological extrapolations on. And we just, collectively, we just don't want to get into all of that. So the best thing to do is throw out those other 99 tests.
Just deny it. It's easier.
Right. Exactly. And that's the thing.
Well, the sadness for me is this. Although this didn't represent a symbol, what was not representative of my personal beliefs or faith, I felt so frustrated that because, all these years leading up to when I built the website, I just took for granted everybody knew what I knew. It never occurred to me, because I was sort of on the inside of it all, that everybody didn't know what I knew. Mm-hmm. And once I realized how little of what we really know about the Shroud was getting out to the public, they say Jews and Catholics always feel guilty about something. And I truly was feeling that I hadn't finished what I had begun, and I felt compelled, I felt obligated, that I needed to get this information out so that other people would have access to the same information that I had, and they could make up their own minds about this, but basing it on what we truly know, not on how the media spins it. And trust me, the media can spin it in both directions. I've seen media spin pro-authenticity and against authenticity. I've heard nonsense from the anti-authenticity people and from the pro-authenticity people. Be careful of the extremes, because you know what? The truth is always somewhere between the extremes. And with the Shroud, the scientific evidence is so compelling and overwhelming that I am obligated to get up on national radio and television programs to the point where I would stand up and publicly say, I believe this is the real thing.
Exactly. So, I want to ask you about an environmental impact on the Shroud. Now, I would assume if the Shroud does date from 1st century Palestine, that somewhere, somehow, some way, it accumulated some spores or pollen or seeds or something that we can point to, this shroud, this linen, being in this geographic area. Well, is that evidenced on the Shroud?
Well, there is, but it's not hard, definitive scientific evidence. It's more anecdotal, and I'll tell you why. Tape samples were lifted from the surface of the Shroud by our team and by a gentleman named Max Fry, who was a Swiss criminologist, one of the guys who pioneered the idea of lifting tape off of clothing to see what you might find. And now, of course, everybody who watches TV CSI's seen it a million times. But he was one of the pioneers in applying that sticky tape to things. And so he took them from the Shroud, and he claimed to have found certain pollen samples, which he characterized and identified. Problem is, he died before he finished his study and never completed the analysis of it as he had intended. The problem with his work was it didn't ever get published into any journals, number one. And it may not have been able to because he was not a palynologist, he was a criminalist. So it wasn't his field of expertise. Some of the things that he identified, he showed photomicrographs of scanning from scanning electron microscope, and initially identified that as a pollen he found on the shroud. It wasn't until years later we found out, no, that was a reference pollen. So that wasn't from the shroud after all. Well, that makes that evidence a little more questionable, and I don't know if your listeners are aware of it, but in 2002, the Turin authorities, in secret and without consulting any of their own scientific advisors, spent 32 days. They took off all the patches, removed the backing cloth, vacuumed the cloth, scraped away all the charred areas from the 1532 fire, and vacuumed it. So we'll never be able to do a proper scientific pollen study. Now, there's an Israeli botanist, Avinoam Danin, who has identified some of these pollens to very specific plants that are only found in that area regionally. The problem is, a number of years after he made those claims, he came back and said, well, I'm going to have to back away from that a little bit because we can't really identify a genus and species just from looking at an ancient or an old pollen. So, unfortunately, there's sort of cloud over that data, and although it's anecdotal and supportive of the other evidence we have, it is not nearly as definitive as some of the chemistry and other data that was collected by our team that was done by instruments that did measurements right from the surface of the shroud. So you have to be careful in looking at the data and understanding what the limitations are, remembering we worked in 1978 with what was then the best technology available. By today's standards, it was pretty much medieval, by what we can do today. 30 years have passed now. So
that's
there is a limit.
That's the remarkable thing. Just in these 30 years, the level of technology that we have for executing scientific analysis is just, it's off the scope. And I can't even imagine, 2009, I can't even imagine what we have at our fingertips to look at it now. And I assume that, and folks, let me break here. Please go to www.shroud.com because, it is a treasure trove of information, and you will spend hours, I know I did, just poring over the information. But what I was going to say is the shroud receiving ongoing examination, or have they secreted it away into some underground bunker?
It's locked up in the cathedral in Turin. It will be made public, put on public exhibition in 2010, starting April 10th of 2010 for about a month. They haven't yet set the closing date of that exhibition. So the public will be able to see the actual shroud on display in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin. But right now it's locked away. It is in a special case. It is no longer rolled up, which they did for centuries, and kept in a silver casket. It's no longer kept that way. It's kept flat. It's kept in a light-tight special case. The air is purged out of it. It's in an argon-nitrogen atmosphere, temperature and humidity controlled. Light kept away from it because ultraviolet can damage it and can damage the image or cause an aging of the background of the cloth, darkening the background, making the image less visible. And so it's properly protected now, but they're not granting access to anyone to examine the cloth. So much of the research that's still going on comes from samples that our team collected back in '78 and from data that was published in the journals from our team that has become the basis for further research by other scientists. And there's still some samples available. Rogers, for example, Ray Rogers, had samples in his collection. When he passed away, he left those to me. I'm currently working with Los Alamos National Laboratory and some scientists there to do further testing, but their preliminary testing, which was announced in Ohio last August at a conference on the shroud, indicates that Rogers' analysis of the samples are absolutely correct, that corner is anomalous, that there is cotton there, that there is a dye has been applied to the surface of that repaired corner to make it match the color of the rest of the shroud. And so there's now, and this past year there were 2 additional peer-reviewed papers published in major journals supporting the evidence that says this. So it's no longer just one man's opinion or 2 people's opinion. There is now a growing amount of absolute hard science that proves that corner is anomalous. Now,
Well,
you know,
let me
what
stop
does
you
that
there.
mean? Yeah.
Let me stop you there because we're coming up on our
Find your
final break. That's a great place to hang people up. Ladies and gentlemen, we have Mr. Barry M. Schwartz as our special guest tonight. We are discussing the Shroud of Turin. We've still got 30 minutes to go, so hang on to your hats. This is Dimension X. I am your host, Dr. William Lester, and we will be right back at you.
The girl that got away. Okay, let's say it was 5 years to the day. She was the girl with the kind smile. That's just her way. Whatever ailed you, she'd be there with the word. But I never said how I feel. It's really absurd. The girl that got away, I don't want to talk about it. The girl that got away, I don't want to think about it. The girl that got away. When I think about the times I just said no, I slept at kindness with a silence. I know it was cold. Then one day I realized she didn't show. I felt deserted, but deep inside I know it's my fault. I nurtured my pride. The girl that got away, I don't want to talk about it. The girl that got away, I don't want to think about it. The girl that got away.
Dimension X Radio with Dr. William Lester is on the air now, live from Atlanta, Georgia, on ShadowTalkRadio.com.
And we are back live on Dimension X, and I am your host, Dr. William Lester, and our guest tonight is Mr. Barry M. Schwartz, and we are discussing the Shroud of Turin. Now, I'm going to bring up some issues that I have heard referencing the Shroud. And
William, if I might, could I quickly just make a quick interjection for those who go to the website? I want to make it clear that there is a search engine that searches within the website itself, and that the content of the website, if you really want to get into it, you go to the website library. And that also has access to the website search engine. So, because it's so deep now, there's so much material there, to find things, I had to put the search engine there so I could find things that I'd put there myself. So anyway, I just wanted to interject that so that the viewers aren't overwhelmed when they get there. If you use the search engine in the website library, you'll find pretty much everything you're looking for.
That's right, ladies and gentlemen. And you can go to the Dimension X website, which is dimensionx.synthesite.com. That's SYNTHASIAT.com, and link over, or you can just go directly to www.shroud.com. And the website it's literally out of sight. I mean, it's so much information. Find out everything you want to know. But excuse me. Every area of research into anomalous phenomena has its own set of debunkers.
Absolutely.
However, they all, utilize exactly the same modus operandi. And one of the things that I hear, and it drives me up the wall, and I'm sure it does you as well, is the comments on paint. Now, talk to us about why this is not a painting.
Okay, well, first of all, if you have a painting, you can test that with instruments that are used typically for art analysis and authentication. Because the conventional wisdom in 1978, when we examined the Shroud, was that it most likely was a painting, I thought it would be, we took with us those instruments necessary to evaluate it. We had our own X-ray equipment because any lead-based paints would have immediately shown up. And the irony is this. I thought it was a painting until I got there and it was laid before me. It took me about 3 or 4 minutes with a 10x magnifier looking at places where the image was to realize there's not one particle of any pigment anywhere on the Shroud. Now, I mentioned earlier we took some tape samples off the surface. Some of those tape samples went to a gentleman named Walter McCrone, who was a world-renowned microscopist at the time, passed away now. Walter found a particle of red oxide paint and immediately claimed that the Shroud was a painting. Now, the frustration we have with that, and the best analogy that I can use to describe why that's nonsense, if you were to take some tape samples from the carpeting around my desk, you would probably find some cookie crumbs. But I can assure you my carpet's not made of cookies. And just because you find a particle of paint on the Shroud doesn't mean that the Shroud is a painting. And as a matter of fact, we found particles of paint all over the Shroud, but so microscopic as to only be visible with a microscope, and so randomly dispersed, there are no more of these particles of paint in the image area than there is in the non-image area. And if you were to scrape all the paint on the Shroud of Turin into one pile, you'd still need a microscope to see it. The Shroud is not a painted image. Now, people can claim that it is, and many people over the last 30 years have made efforts to duplicate the Shroud. And, it's not that hard to make an image onto linen. But you have to, if you're going to claim this is how the Shroud was made, then it must match the chemical and physical properties of the Shroud of Turin. Nobody's ever come close. There's no paint or pigment on the Shroud in sufficient quantities to be visible, let alone to create the image that we see there. Now, I can say that, and people might still be skeptical, so I always say, look, ignore the conclusions of the scientists, if you will, But go look at the data, which is available, and you can see that the evidence shows us, proves it's not a painting. So I keep hearing it. You know, you mentioned Leonardo earlier. I laughed when you said it because when that theory first came out, I'm no expert in history. It's kind of my weak point. But I know that the shroud is documented in historical record a full 100 years before Leonardo was born. I know he was a good artist, but he wasn't that good. And so,
I don't think he had time travel.
Not exactly. Perspective. I don't know anyone who's ever seen the real shroud the way I have and spent time with it the way I have who walks away saying, oh, well, it's a painting. The only people who say that it's a painting are people who've only seen the shroud in photographs. Okay? And so maybe I'm responsible for part of that because they're often my photographs that they're looking at. But trust me, it took me 3 or 4 minutes, and I know of no one who's ever seen it that walks away thinking it's a painting.
The
but,
Gospels,
you know, when you look at it in a book or in a reproduction or something, well, maybe it gives that appearance.
The Gospel accounts do not provide us with a physical description of Jesus, yet whether you're Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, whatever, if you say the word Jesus, you will get a mental image in your mind. Where does
like
that
the man on the shroud?
What exactly? Well, yeah, that's right. And so my question is, for the audience, where do we get that image of Jesus from, and how fascinating is it that that image correlates perfectly to the man on the shroud?
Well, you know, interestingly enough, for the first few hundred years after Jesus' death, he was depicted in the Roman style, bald head with a little wreath around it, the way they depicted Caesar or anybody else on their, emperors on their coins and stuff. Jesus was depicted that way. It isn't until 285 A.D. in the Roman catacombs, the Domitia catacombs, that the first image of Jesus, looking like we've all come to become familiar with, the man on the shroud, the first image of Jesus shows up in this catacomb, and guess what? It looks just like the man on the shroud. Mm-hmm. My belief is, remembering that these were Jews that captured this cloth out of the tomb who weren't supposed to have it, they had to keep it a secret, they passed it on. It may have sat in a chest passed on from generation to generation for those almost 250 years before somebody took it out and even noticed there was an image on it. I've often said that, if that image were blatantly visible to the disciples when they opened the tomb, it would have probably gotten into the Gospels. My guess is, and this is just my opinion, a lot of people, even scientists, may disagree with me on this, but it may well be that that image took some time before it became visible, and it might have not been even, look, when you stand in front of the shroud at arm's length, it's hard to see the image. You have to back away from it. So they may not have immediately noticed it, or they may have noticed it and said, boy, we better hide this, this is heresy, because this is a graven image or something.
I have a comment from the chat room.
Sure.
Someone is saying, and this is kind of, I guess, a ethnic studies question, that the man on the shroud to this individual seems to have rather European features, and does this mesh with what we know about Jews in first century Palestine? Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I will. I don't necessarily agree with that conclusion. He definitely looks Semitic. If you look at the nose, it looks like my grandfather, okay? So, I mean, but because we don't have anything to correlate it to, it's sort of a moot point. We can argue that point forever. But I can point to what's called an anthropometric study that was done, where they took the dimensions of the limbs, the shape of the body weight and type, and they correlated it with anthropological studies of various traits and characteristics of various body types from different cultures and parts of the world. And they determined through anthropometric studies that the man depicted on the shroud is a Mideastern Semitic man. Well, that's pretty much what we all believe it is. So I think that although he may appear somewhat European, remember that most people are familiar with the black and white negative view of the shroud, dark background, light image of the man, and it gives a certain false sense of, some people have said, oh, he's got blonde hair. Well, we can't tell that from the shroud. we can't tell that. Some people have said he's got blue eyes. Well, he was a Semitic first-century Jew. He had dark hair. He probably had olive skin. But we can't tell that from the shroud because the shroud didn't record any color data of this man. So we have no way of saying with any authority that, oh yes, well, his hair was black or white. Remember this, is that in modern times, we can get on an airplane and we can be anywhere we want in 24 hours or less.
Right.
In first century times, people didn't wander more than a few miles from where they were born through most of their lives. So we didn't have this people moving around and sort of mixing the gene pools. So to assume, for example, that the man was blonde would be sort of silly for a first-century Jew because there weren't too many Nordic types getting to the Mideast in those days.
Yeah,
so there was no mixing of those gene pools. So, but I think that the man of the shroud, according to the real experts, and I'm certainly not one of those in that field of anthropology, but they've looked at it and said, no, this is a Semitic male. And that would be consistent with a first-century Jew, of course.
Right, and people should understand this is one of those things that harkens back to your comment about people not knowing what you know. A lot of people who, well, they're not historians, but
right.
what they don't understand is you cannot look at Palestine or Israel today and get a accurate measure of what it was like then.
Not at all, because if you remember, most of the immigration into Israel happened after World War II, when tens of thousands of immigrants from Eastern and Western Europe emigrated over to Israel.
Right.
So we've had a mixing of the gene pool dramatically in modern times, and so we can't look there now and say, oh, well, this is typical of what somebody in the first century would have looked like.
Right.
And so I think that, it's a mistake to jump to those conclusions, yet people do it every day. That paper that I was talking about, that anthropometric study, by the way, is on the website, so it is available for anybody who wants to find it there.
What would you say, because here's the thing, if you are not a Christian and you look at the shroud and you hear this conversation about the shroud and you know all this analysis and we're leaning towards authenticity, etc. And you may not be that enthusiastic about the shroud's authenticity. What would you say to that person? Conversely, to the person who is I guess, there are Christians and then there are Christians, just like anything else. There are hardcore evangelical believers, literalists, Okay, so how would you, address those people? Yeah.
Well,
go ahead.
First of all, I know of no one whose faith relies on the Shroud of Turin. Okay. If your faith is so weak that you need something that heavy piece of evidence, well, then maybe you should go back and re-examine your faith, because your faith.
No, not that.
Your faith shouldn't rely on any external object. Faith, the whole idea of faith is to accept and believe, and not to have any kind of hard evidence to back it up. But I also tell people this, is that if you're looking at the shroud and it has some significance to you, well, the answer's not on that piece of cloth. The answer really is in the eye of the beholder, or more importantly, maybe in the heart of the beholder. And each of us has to examine the shroud, study it, and learn as much about it as we need to come to whatever conclusion we want. And I've said this at my lectures many times. Look, I'm not keeping score, and I'm not trying to convince anybody of anything. But I feel that if you're going to have an opinion, and this is very important to many people on this planet, this whole subject matter, then if you're going to have an opinion of the shroud, make it an opinion based on fact and not pundits and nonsense and TV documentaries and websites and commercial books, because none of those venues have any kind of standard of honesty, accuracy, or integrity to adhere to, but all of the scientific journals do. And although even that process is imperfect, it is what science uses as a basis for what's real and what's not real in the modern world. And the science and the scientific evidence about the shroud is both compelling and overwhelming in favor of its authenticity. Now,
well,
I mentioned... Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, no, I want to ask you two questions, and they are in ascending degrees of difficulty.
Okay.
Okay. The first question is, you feel, based on 30-plus years of analysis,
Yes.
do you feel that this shroud is the image of the historical Jesus of Nazareth? That's question number one.
And that's easy. Yes.
Okay. Question
Absolutely.
okay. The question number two is much more difficult. If you were backed up against the wall, how do you think the image was formed?
Okay. I have an answer for that, too. Ray Rogers, may he rest in peace, passed away. The chemist who was the head chemist of our team and from Los Alamos National Labs for 40 years, defined a chemical process so complex and so amazing that most people just say, well, that's impossible. But it accounts for every physical and chemical property of that image. Now, rather than try and describe that in the few remaining minutes that we have, I'm going to tell people that if you go to the website and you read the work of Rogers, and there's about 9 different papers by Rogers there, including one very specifically about image formation, it's a complex chemical process. Now, a lot of people say to me, particularly Christians, well, does that take away from the miraculous nature of the image? Well, look, God can make images on linen any way he wants to. And if God chooses to make an image on linen, you know, most people are looking for what I call the Cecil B. DeMille miracle. That's a flash of light, a puff of smoke, and a big noise. But, you know, God doesn't need to go that route. He can take a very complex chemical reaction with a very specific kind of linen that had to be manufactured in a very particular kind of way, and it had to interact, it had to be treated a certain way, so it had this surface coating that would then interact with the outgassing of the body, the beginnings of decay, and that the amines escaping from the body created what's called a Maillard reaction, and now you can see why I didn't want to go into much detail on the air. It's very complicated. I actually had somebody ask me, does that take away the possibility of a miracle? And I looked at this woman and I said, listen, ma'am, if you understood what the statistical odds were for this to have happened once in history, and only once that we know of, I said, how much of a miracle, what are you looking for a miracle? If that isn't a miracle, what is? So I don't see that there's anything that goes against the miraculous nature of the image for those who perceive it that way. Mm-hmm. But I also think that there could be, I mean, within God's universe, God can do anything, and if he wants to make an image on linen, he can use a very complex chemical process. He doesn't need a flash of light and a puff of smoke. So I guess it becomes really dependent on your definition of a miracle. But if it's something that goes beyond science, well, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. Rogers' explanation at least accounts for all the chemical and physical properties of the image. A lot of people don't agree with him because it isn't enough of a miracle for them, or for other reasons. But I personally believe that that's the best explanation that I've heard from a scientific point of view, that at least accounts for the properties of the image as we find them there.
Well, and again,
did I answer it?
Oh, yeah, that was a beautiful answer. Again, and people, I love your definition. I love this Cecil B. DeMille response, because even if it was an anomalous event, well, clearly it was.
Sure.
You know, a miracle does not presuppose that there was no natural process at work.
And I always ask people, what makes you think that God has to go outside of the universe that he created with all the rules that he created for science and everything else? Why would he have to go outside of that to make an image on a piece of linen? That should be pretty easy for God. And he can use whatever process that he's already created for that instead of going back to my dramatic Cecil B. DeMille bolt of lightning version, you know? Now, if I might, I'd like to mention one thing to the listeners before we run out of time.
Sure.
Because usually, you know, I appear in a lot of these documentaries on the Shroud, and I'm often disappointed. Recently, there was a new one. It's airing again February 1st, Sunday, February 1st, 9 p.m. East Coast time on the Discovery Channel. It features Ray Rogers and the story of his work. And it's the first documentary, for example, that agreed, that proved the Shroud was not a painting and it didn't go there. It's the first documentary that doesn't have skeptics going, no, it's not, and somebody else going, yes, it is. It's a documentary that talks about the science. It talks about the human interest story behind a man like Rogers, this sort of grizzled old scientist who was so tough on everybody, who ultimately, perhaps, answered the questions that have been the hardest questions to be answered. And so I'm pleased, even though I'm a participant in it. You'll get to see what I look like. I am definitely an old hippie. You'll see that there's a story there that kind of cuts through all the rhetoric that we've all heard about the Shroud time and time again, and it's got the real story of the people involved, but it squeezes more science into this one documentary than the last three of them that were done combined. So, February 1st, Discovery Channel, 9 p.m. Eastern Time. Catch it and send me an email, let me know what you thought. In the end, I believe it's probably among the very finest documentaries ever done on the Shroud. It's fair, it's honest, and it doesn't go where all the others have gone.
Excellent. Well, ladies and gentlemen, there you have it, The Shroud of Turin, by an imaging expert, Mr. Barry M. Schwartz, who's been up close and personal with the Shroud since 1978. I want to thank Mr. Schwartz for being our guest tonight. And Mr. Schwartz, what I'd like for you to do is to hold the line because
Sure.
when we go off the air, we can kind of have our little post-show commentary.
Absolutely.
So, ladies and gentlemen, again, this has been Dimension X.